History, a series of lectures exploring the conspiratorial view of history. It is the contention of historian Ralph Epperson that wars, revolutions, and depressions are planned years in advance, and that those who have been involved in the planning of these events have been ensuring that their involvement has been removed from recorded history. It will be Ralph Epperson's purpose to discuss the major events of the past and to remove the veil that has been utilized to cover up the secrets of history.
Welcome to Secrets of History. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I'm going to be the host of this series. I've called this series Secrets of History because it'll be my attempt to introduce you to the conspiratorial view of history and what I call the cover-ups of the past 200 years in American history. This is going to be a 24-week series that I'll be presenting for your edification so that you can learn a little bit more about how our history has been covered up by people who have changed it for very important reasons that we're going to learn in the next 24 weeks. Perhaps the first question we should answer is who am I and why do I believe I'm capable of teaching a class like this or a series of lectures like this? I'm a 1959 graduate of the University of Arizona, and I felt that meant I had been educated, and I felt that all I needed to complete my education was just experience, another 4 or 5 years, and I'd be a genius. It took me about 4 years to start thinking that I had much to learn and that much of what I had been taught was not true. In 1963, a friend of mine suggested I start reading what he called revisionist history, and I started reading revisionist history, and I started to discover that there was something happening in our history books. It just wasn't true. I was not familiar with the term revisionist history, and so I started reading. I started, as I said, in 1963, and I've read over 500 books, and I'm sure that's not very many in comparison to someone who's really a book addict, but some of these books have been on both sides of the issue, and some of them have been very, very heavy and important. I try to bring my books with me for a very important reason. I want you to learn that these ideas that I'm expressing in these lectures, of 24-week lectures, are not my ideas, but those of the people who have written about it or those who have been involved. I've been lecturing on this subject for 14 years now, and my lecture notes were finally culminated in 1985 when I wrote this book called The Unseen Hand. This is an attempt to put all of my research of 24 years into one book. It's 488 pages long, and it covers all of the material that we're going to be covering in this series of 24 weeks. First of all, I want you to understand that I'm not a teacher. I don't claim to be a teacher. I wasn't trained as a teacher. I just happened to be one who was curious about history, and so I started reading. Because I'm not a teacher, I don't want you to reject my conclusions because I've not presented this material properly. In other words, I'm encouraging you to do your own research because the material I'm going to bring to you is not mine. This is not my thought. These are the thoughts of those who have been involved. I was asked to teach a class on the conspiratorial view of history in 1973, and I was very happy to do so. So I started putting my lecture notes together, and my students were encouraging me to put my notes and my research into a book form. I had no intention of doing that, but I did in 1985, and now that book is selling. I also want you to know this, that I'm solely responsible for the content of this class. There's no group supporting this, no organization, and no other individual. I've been doing all of my own research, and so what we're going to discover has been the result of my 24 years of reading into the 500 books that we're going to cover. No one has paid me to offer my views, so this is strictly my research, my sequence, and my content, so please bear that in mind. Also, I think it's also very important for you to know that the material we're going to cover is no longer a belief. I'm quite convinced that what I call the conspiratorial view of history is correct, and that indeed there is a conspiracy at work in the major events of the past, and that conspiracy does exist, as we're going to try to prove to you. I believe it is fact, not fiction. Now, the information we're going to cover in the next 24 weeks, I'm sure will be quite contrary to all that you've heard in the past. And because it is, I'm certain you're going to disagree. Much of this material is very depressing. We're going to show you that wars and depressions and revolutions are planned years in advance. But I do believe there is hope, and we'll cover that in the last session. When I was living in the Northwest up in Oregon, I read this large poster, number 1 on the screen, that I thought was very appropriate to what we're going to be covering today. It's an Indian prayer, and it reads, "Grant that I may not criticize my neighbor until I have walked a mile in his moccasins." I'm going to change that to Epperson's prayer, number 2. "Grant that I may not criticize Epperson until I have walked 24 weeks in his tennis shoes." What I'm trying to say is I'm asking you to bear with me for 24 weeks to prove my contention. In other words, understand that I've got a great deal of material to cover, and please decide to hold your opinion until after I'm through. I'm also quite convinced I'm going to offend all those in the audience tonight, as well as those viewing this series for the next weeks, and I'm sorry about that. I can't be responsible for the comments of others, but I want you to know that if for some reason I miss you and you don't get offended, I want you to take offense that I didn't offend you, because I want to make sure I get everybody. One of the reasons I say that is because many of our heroes, the people that we've respected and loved for so many years, as we're going to see, are not heroes at all. And that many of the beliefs that we hold as a nation are not true, are not correct. And so I'm going to try to explain that to you by setting the record straight, to tell the truth that my research has exposed to me. There are basically 2 schools of history. Number 3, the first one is called the accidental view of history, and this holds that events happen by accident. No one really knows why things happen, they just do. This is what we've been taught all of our lives. I'll give you an example of how this thing works between this view that I call the accidental view and the view that I hold that I call the conspiratorial view of history. The accidental view holds that Pearl Harbor, the attack by the Japanese government on the island of Pearl Harbor that preceded World War II, actually started World War II, was the malicious attack of the Japanese government, and that the American government had no warning and no foreknowledge of that, and there certainly was no provocation. This is what we've been told by the accidental school of history. In other words, the attack was an accident. No one really knew why it happened. Let me give you a couple of examples of those who believe in this thing called the accidental theory of history. James P. Warburg, an author that we'll be reading off and on during this course, wrote this book called The West in Crisis. He says this in his book, The West in Crisis, about the accidental view of history. He says, number 4, history is written more by accident than by design, often by the acts of madmen. In other words, we don't know why these things happen. Madmen jump up and down and start wars and revolutions and depressions. And because of that, we can't explain why. We certainly can't anticipate or even have foreknowledge of the event. All we have to do is sit back and watch, in essence, and then react to it. Another example of someone who commented about the accidental view of history was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who, perhaps as you might remember, was the National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter in the 1970s. He wrote this about the accidental view, number 5. History is much more the product of chaos than of conspiracy. Increasingly, policymakers are overwhelmed by events and information. So this is basically the accidental view. We really don't know why things happen, they just do. And all we can do is react to them. We certainly can't forestall them or prevent them because no one knows why they happen. I don't hold that position after 24 years of research, and I want to call my view of history the conspiratorial view, number 6. The conspiratorial view of history holds that events happen by design. People plan these events years in advance. We're going to discuss Pearl Harbor later on in this series, and I'm going to show you that our government, the American government, knew about Pearl Harbor years in advance. And indeed, our government, Franklin Roosevelt, as president, actually forced Japan into attacking America, and that is the difference between the accidental view and the conspiratorial view. One view holds it was an accident, the other holds that it was the result of a conspiracy. Franklin Roosevelt, as I said, our president during World War II, and also very heavily involved in many of the serious events we're going to discuss in this series, said this about the conspiratorial view of history. He said, number 7, in politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way. We're going to see that Mr. Roosevelt, I believe, is correct, that the major events of the past have been caused by people who want them to be caused, these events. Let's define the word conspiracy so that you'll understand how this thing works, because we're going to see that a conspiracy operates in secret, and because of that, it makes it difficult to find out why or how they're doing these things. So let's define number 8, the word conspiracy, out of Webster's. A conspiracy is a combination of people or persons working in secret for an evil purpose. So the question is, why do evil people work in secret? Because they have an evil purpose, obviously. They must meet in secret. If someone is going to do something that the people don't want to happen, and if they knew about in advance they would prevent, then they have to work in secret. Let me try to explain to you how this whole thing is going to work by use of the blackboard here. We're going to be covering a series of historical events, one by one, putting them into position. As we go through this series, we'll be covering these wars and depressions and revolutions and famines, etc. And we're going to see that all of them fit together and form a puzzle that proves that this conspiracy exists. Each individual part does not prove the conspiracy, obviously. So maybe this part doesn't do it, or this part, or this one or that one. But the more parts of the puzzle you put together, the more you can see, I believe, this conspiracy does indeed exist. Now, my point about doing it this way is I want you to understand that let's say that you don't agree with this position. Let's say that I teach something or offer, say it's an explanation of the Civil War, let's say, and you can't agree with that. I'm sorry, I just don't buy your explanation of the Civil War. And let's also say for some reason you can't buy my explanation of the World War II. Even though you don't have to agree with those two positions, even though those two don't quite fit into your understanding, you can still see with the rest of the parts of the puzzle that you do agree with. The word conspiracy is still almost there. If I had to show you people that, if I had to convince you that 100% of this thing is true, I wouldn't even try. I can't do that, and because I can't, I'm not going to try. In other words, if you reject parts of it, after you get through, I still think you'll be able to see the conspiracy and that it does indeed exist. So please don't hold me responsible for all the activity before you decide. Decide on the preponderance of the evidence. I think you'll still be able to see there's a conspiracy in total. So obviously, if I can't do it in 24 weeks, then I would agree there's something wrong. So my goal will be to convince you in 24 weeks. This is a little government pamphlet that came out during the bicentennial process. It's called The American Economic System and Your Part in It. This was paid for by our tax dollars in part. And I want to read a quote out here because this is the accidental view of history here. It says, number 9, because we have a democratic government, our country goes where we, all of us together, decide we want to take it. That's called the accidental view of history. We are in charge of those events, and we certainly are able to control them because, at least in our country, we make our own decisions. We are told, in fact, I'm going to offer you the other option. I'm going to try to prove to you that position is not correct, that we are not in charge of our government. And let's start over here with a presidential election, and let's say there's a Republican running and a Democrat. And through the primaries, these two candidates are finally selected. The Democratic candidate selected, the Republican candidate selected, and then we choose whichever we want. Let's just say in this case the Democrat wins. After he wins the nomination, let's say, he picks his vice president. In fact, these are still in the primaries, so this is not the general election, this is the primaries. The Democratic convention, the Democratic candidate at the convention picks his vice president. Let's say that after he's elected, the Democrat is elected, he then picks his cabinet, he picks the Supreme Court justices, etc. This is the view that we're hold, that we are in charge of selecting the candidates in the Republican primaries and the ones in the Democratic primaries, and then he selects the people that he wants to surround him. Another thing, over here in Cuba, we've been told by those who write the accidental view of history that the Cuban people decided they didn't like the Batista government, so they popularly uprose to overthrow Batista and put in Fidel Castro. That's what we've been told by the accidental view of history. Another example would be in China, let's say. In China, we've been told that the Chinese people violently opposed Chiang Kai-shek and the government that he had, so they uprose spontaneously, generally, to overthrow that and impose communism on the rest of China. And let's take one last example. In Russia, let's say, we've been told by those who write the accidental view of history that the Tsar of Russia was a tyrant and an oppressor, and the people uprose voluntarily and spontaneously to overthrow him and impose communism in Russia. This is basically what we've been told from one side to the other about history in the past. This is called the accidental view of history. I'm going to try to prove in this series that all of these events are connected. That someone up at the very top, a conspiracy, controls all of these events. Let's go over here to our Democratic and Republican primaries. It's my position, as we're going to see later on, that our candidates in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party are selected for us, and then they go out and ask us to vote for them. So that no matter who wins either the Republican or the Democratic primary, it's the candidate of the conspiracy. They don't care which one wins. So it is a democracy. We get to choose. Let's say the Democratic candidate is at least in the primaries, he selects his vice president. I believe this conspiracy tells him who to select. I believe that after he's elected, he's told who to appoint to the Supreme Court and who to appoint into the cabinet. And in many cases, the president and the cabinet don't even know each other until they meet for the first time after he's been selected. I believe that in Cuba, this conspiracy is the one that overthrew Batista and put Fidel Castro into power. They wanted Cuba to go communist. I believe that in China, this conspiracy controlled the activities over there and overthrew the Chiang Kai-shek government to put Mao Tse-tung and Zhou Enlai in power because they wanted China to go communist. I believe this conspiracy is the one that overthrew the Tsar and decided to replace them with Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolshevik communists. In other words, this conspiracy has been controlling our history for probably at least the last 200 years. That's my position. That's the difference between the accidental view of history and the conspiratorial view of history. In fact, this is probably in one sentence states my position in this class. Number 10. There is a huge, deeply entrenched, extremely powerful conspiracy at work to achieve absolute and brutal rule over the whole human race. That's what we're going to see, hopefully, in the next 24 hours of these lectures. Now, the next question is, if there is a conspiracy and they're working in secret, how do you expose them? And that's a fair question. There are basically three ways. Number one, those who are inside the conspiracy come out and tell us about it. That's rather rare. But there are examples, as we see, as we go through this course, that there are people who have done that and have told us the truth about their involvement inside the conspiracy. Secondly, historians dig out the information and publish it. Or thirdly, someone unknowingly reveals some of the activities, an historian or a writer or something, and talks about something that he discovered, but doesn't even, in many cases, doesn't understand how it fits in. Those are the three basic ways you expose a conspiracy. I guess you'd call me a number two. My goal is to look into the writings of others to try to find the evidences and then bring it to your attention. Number three is far more common, where people are writing more about these activities or these events, and in many cases they're not even aware that they're revealing parts of this conspiracy, but it is happening. And of course there are more and more historians now who are really digging into this thing every year. How many people are in this conspiracy? And of course this is the most difficult question of all to answer because I don't know. There's no way that I can tell you how many there are because they don't tell us. And because they don't tell us, there's no way to know. And I won't doubt that even in this example, there are probably layers on top of layers. Conspirators controlling people on top of other layers. And so that the higher you go, the more secret these people become. However, there have been clues for us to know that there is a conspiracy and that certain numbers are operating. Let me give you an example here in quote number 11. This was written by Walter Rathenau back in 1909. He was the head of the German General Electric Company. And here's what he said, number 11. 300 men, all of whom know one another, direct the economic destiny of Europe and choose their successors from among themselves. Another who commented about the number of these conspirators was a man by the name of Joseph P. Kennedy. Now, Joseph Kennedy was the father of President John Kennedy, and of course the father of Bobby Kennedy, our Attorney General, who was also slain, as was John, and of course the father of Teddy, who's now sitting in the Senate of the United States. Joseph Kennedy said this, number 12, 50 men have run America, and that's a high figure. So our position that we, the people, are in charge is not basically correct if Joseph Kennedy is correct. Another who commented about these things was David Rockefeller. And here's what he said, number 13. David Rockefeller, of course, one of the world's wealthiest Americans, but he said this, number 13, the Soviets have believed their own propaganda that a small group of families, including our own, really run this country, in which the government is just sort of a front. That's also my position as well. I believe there is a small group of people controlling these events, as we're going to see. The next gentleman I want to bring to your attention is a PhD by the name of Carroll Quigley. Dr. Carroll Quigley was a professor of history at Georgetown University. Before that, he taught at Princeton and at Harvard. Dr. Quigley wrote this book called Tragedy and Hope. It's, as you can see, a rather voluminous work. It's 1,300 pages. By the way, one thing I have to mention here is that these are my copies of these books. I can't afford to buy new ones, so you can see they're rather beat up. Please understand that. That means I've read the book. And hopefully that'll be some evidence to you that I've read this material before I brought it to your attention. He wrote this book entitled Tragedy and Hope, published by Macmillan and Company, and in that book he does one thing that few historians have done in the past. He states that there is a conspiracy. He becomes aware of it. He said he became aware of it for 20 years prior to his writing the book. And he states further that he supports this conspiracy. This is extremely rare in the history of the past. He says that he was permitted to examine this conspiracy's secret papers for 2 years prior to writing his book. Let's see what he says about this conspiracy, number 14. There does exist an international network which operates in the way the radical right believes the Communist Act. In fact, this network has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other group, and frequently does so. I know of the operations of this network, he says. I have no aversion to it and have for much of my life been close to it and many of its instruments. I have objected to a few of its policies, but in general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough to be known. Now, I want you to notice the name of his book. He calls it Tragedy and Hope. Now, why is that significant? He believes that these people are the hope of the future, and he says that in his book. And he says the tragedy is that they're not public yet. They've not succeeded. That's why he calls his book Tragedy and Hope. Another writer, Taylor Caldwell, until her recent death, one of America's most prolific writers on this conspiracy, wrote this about this conspiracy in her book entitled Ceremony of the Innocent. It's a small paperback that I read a few years ago, and in this little paperback, Taylor Caldwell writes this quote, number 15. The conspirators are the power behind communism. The communists will be financed by the international bankers and their allies. The conspiracy of international men who want to rule the whole globe, to control its industry, economics, currencies, governments, people, for their own use and for their own power, and to reduce every nation to the status of slaves under their whips. Power, power, she says. In another one of her books, Taylor Caldwell wrote this, in her book entitled Captains and Kings. She has the father of her hero in this book say this about this conspiracy. She says, number 16, these men are the real rulers of the world. They can make you president of the United States, and they can destroy you too, and no one would ever know who did it. Now, why do people join this conspiracy? An author by the name of Blair Cohn wrote this, number 17. The reader may ask why these illustrious men would join such a conspiracy. The answer is quite the reverse of the question. These men became illustrious primarily because they were part of the conspiracy. Let me try to illustrate how that works. Because there's a differing of opinion here, because they say, why would a president want to get involved with a conspiracy? My position is that he became president because he was involved in the conspiracy. I claim this is like a ladder. And you climb rungs to that ladder before you become president, let's say. Or if you want to, you run for the Senate or you become a senator. What happens is, down here, the man runs, let's say, for the city council. This might be his first attempt at political office. And I believe at this layer, people outside are watching him, people inside this conspiracy. They're going to urge him to run for higher office. And they might very well, let's say they ask him to run for mayor. He does so, they give him the financial support he needs, and they might very well even offer him maybe an under-the-table inducement to run, or maybe some way after he becomes mayor, a little contract under the table where he gets some financial reward. The reason they do that is to get control of him. Once they get him hooked, then they can make sure that when he runs for governor, he'll do what he's told. Let's say next that he might decide to run for the Senate. All the time he's running for these offices, the conspiracy is watching his activity. The further up he goes, the more perilous become his tasks and the more lucrative become his rewards. And that's what this is all about. Ultimately, he might very well become president of the United States. So you don't become president, work your way up, and then join the conspiracy. You work your way up through the ladder. And that's what we're going to try to prove in this course. Now, the next question you might want to ask is, why would the wealthy want to get involved in this conspiracy? And that also is a good question. One who tried to answer that question was a Congressman, John Schmitz, who, by the way, also ran for the presidency back, I think, in 1972 or 76. I've forgotten the year. But Congressman John Schmitz said this about this process of money and power. Number 18. When a person has all the money he needs, his goal becomes power. Let me try to explain to you why that is. Another who commented about this process of power and money was Benjamin Franklin, one of our founding fathers. And here's what he said about money and power, number 19. There are two passions which have a powerful influence on the affairs of men. These are love of power and the love of money. When united, they have the most violent of effects. In other words, you combine money and power, and it's like walking into a tornado. One works on the other. And that's what we're talking about, how these people work their way through the ranks to get power because, first of all, they either have money or because they want to gain money through power. Here's another quote about this concept, about how power works on people. This was issued by Lord Acton. Number 20, he said this: power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. The higher you go, the more corrupt you become. Another man who talked about power was the communist by the name of Bakunin, who said this, number 21, the possession of power transformed into a tyrant even the most devoted friend of liberty. We have much to fear when we give power to our elected officials. Pearl Buck was a writer and also, I guess, a great anthropologist. She wrote this. She was quite a family fan of the Kennedy family, and she wrote about Rose Kennedy, number 22. Rose Kennedy, the mother of the president and obviously the wife of Joseph Kennedy, continuing the quote now, knew that the man she loved a power beyond the power of money. He wanted the power of government, and he would have it. In another book called The Founding Father, the author says this about Joe Kennedy. He said, I like Joe Kennedy. This is number 23. I like Joe Kennedy. He understands power. Power is the end. What other delight is there but to enjoy the sheer sense of control? He would say, let me see any other motive in the people who command. Another who wrote about power was George Orwell, who was a great fiction writer. He wrote several books about this conspiracy, one of which was entitled 1984. I read that book and found it extremely fascinating because in that book he talks about this conspiracy and this power. Here's what he wrote, number 24, inside the book, 1984. The party, and here he's referring to this conspiracy, is not concerned with perpetuating its blood, but with perpetuating itself. Who wields power is not important, provided the hierarchical structure remains always the same. Now, how does this conspiracy get its new members? This is Norman Dodd, who was hired by Congress to investigate tax-free foundations in the middle 50s. Norman Dodd discovered that there was a strong connection between the foundations and this conspiracy, and here's what he said, number 25. The careers of men are watched. The men who indicate that they would be especially capable in terms of the aims of this group are approached quietly and invited into inner circles. They are watched as they carry out assignments, and eventually they are drawn into it under circumstances which make it virtually impossible for them ever to get out of it. Let's summarize all that we've seen so far in this quote, number 26. This is my writing. This conspiracy is completely amoral, utterly ruthless, incredibly cunning, mercilessly cruel, and infinitely evil, as I believe we're going to see in the next 24 hours of sessions. And the reason this conspiracy is able to succeed is simply that the moral mind cannot believe that men would act like this. The moral mind cannot comprehend the fact that evil people could do such things as plan wars, depressions, revolutions, and even some famines that are going to kill millions of people years in advance. And because we can't believe it, they succeed. Now I'm going to impanel all of you as jury members. Now, as you know, when you're on a jury, you're asked to hear both the prosecution and the defense. In 24 hours, I'm going to try to offer the prosecution. And I'm hoping that that will convince you that I'm correct. You've heard the defense. You're not going to hear it in this series of lectures. You've heard the defense all of your life. After you hear the prosecution, I'm hoping you'll then decide whether I'm right or wrong. In other words, please bear with me for 24 weeks. Now, I'd like to briefly cover what we're going to cover in this course in the next 24 hours of lectures. I'm going to try to convince you in those 24 weeks that this conspiracy does indeed exist. We're going to examine this conspiracy's involvement in American and foreign wars, revolutions, and depressions. The first segment we're going to cover are going to give us some basic definitions. We're going to talk about man's rights, whether they come from government or from God, and for a very important reason, as we're going to see. We're going to define and discuss the difference between a right and a privilege. We're going to talk about what are human rights, the right to life, liberty, and property. We're going to discuss the differences between liberty and license. We're going to define the word plunder, meaning stealing, and we're going to show you how government today is legally plundering us. It's not moral, it's not right, but it is legal. Stealing in America has become legal, as we're going to see. We're going to discuss certain economic terms. Wealth, for instance, to define what wealth and surplus is. Capital goods, consumption goods, to show you about factors of production, factories, railroads, etc. We're going to define capitalism. We're going to define capitalistic systems known as free enterprise, socialism, communism, and fascism. By the way, I'm quite convinced the definition of fascism might shock you. You're not going to have heard this definition, but it's one that I think you're going to see that is the type of economic system under which the United States is living today. We're also going to discuss the differences between a democracy and a republic. There are some very important differences, and you're going to discover that America was a republic and is rapidly becoming a democracy. Also, I'd like to discuss and define the term oligarchy. It's not a word that we use very often in our language, but once you understand what the word means, I think you're going to discover that America is living under an oligarchy today as well. In fact, after we cover that material, you're going to see that I believe America is a fascist oligarchy. We'll hold those terms until later. I'm also going to define what I call the pincers movement. This is the strategy under which you can destroy a Republican government without firing a shot. And once you understand how this strategy works, American history will start to make some sense. We're going to next discuss what is the function of government. Why do people create it? And how much power should we give to government? We're going to define inflation out of Webster's. It's been the definition of inflation for over 6,000 years, and we're going to see that it's the definition that we should hold to today. And it's not the definition you get in your economic textbooks. We're also going to discuss money and its purpose and why we should be on a gold standard. We're going to see that the gold standard was removed from America's money back in the 1930s, and we're going to find out why. And we're going to discuss the term fiat money, and we're going to see what fiat money is and why we're carrying fiat money today. We'll discuss coin clipping. It's a strategy by which you remove precious metals from your coins. Many of you know perhaps that in the 1960s, the silver in our coins disappeared. We'll talk about why. I also want to talk about Franklin Roosevelt's unconstitutional call for the gold behind our money in 1933. There was absolutely no authority for Roosevelt to do that, yet he did it. And America turned in 95% of its gold. Our gold was stolen from us. I want to talk about the term, or the phrase, or the word rather, hyperinflation. This is where you need baskets of money to buy a loaf of bread. Its purpose is to destroy the middle class. And we're going to see an example in the 1920s when it was used to destroy Germany's middle class to bring Adolf Hitler into power. It was done by design to bring Hitler into power in the German government. We're going to define monopolistic capitalism, and that's where the factors of production, the factories and railroads, etc., are owned and controlled by the wealthy. And we're going to show you that today, worldwide, communism is monopolistic capitalism. We're going to define the word cartel, and we're going to get into OPEC. And you're going to see that OPEC is not owned by the Arabians, it's not owned by the Venezuelans, it's owned by American and European oil companies. We'll start our history after we study OPEC. We're going to go back to May the 1st, 1776, when a man by the name of Adam Weishaupt formed the Illuminati. That group, 13 years later, caused the French Revolution. The French Revolution that the French even today commemorate as their July 4th, their date of liberation. And I'm going to show you that was the work of a very serious conspiracy, the Illuminati. George Washington, our President of the United States, knew about the Illuminati. We're going to read a letter that he wrote that identifies the Illuminati in America back in 1798. In 1848, the Illuminati surfaced again when they asked Karl Marx, a member of the Illuminati, the father of communism, to write what we call today the Communist Manifesto. This book was written by Karl Marx and Frederick Engels at the request of the Illuminati 70 years after it was formed. Karl Marx was not the spontaneous writer of this work. He was asked to write it by a group in existence for over 70 years. By the way, it's interesting when we study that, we're going to discover that Karl Marx wrote the manifesto for the very wealthy of his day. And yet, inside the manifesto, as we're going to see, Marx wanted or advocated the abolition of private property. Why did the very wealthy want Marx to abolish private property? We'll cover that, and I think you'll find it extremely interesting. We're going to then cover the Russian communist revolutions of 1905 and 1917. These were also planned by wealthy capitalists of America and Europe. And we've been told by the accidental view of history that the Tsar and his family were murdered by the communists in 1917, and I'm going to show you that that did not happen. History has covered up this event. It did not happen. The Tsar and his family survived, and in fact, the Tsarevich, the son of the Tsar, is alive and well even today in New York City. That story is a work of fiction. Next, I want to introduce you to Colonel Edward Mandell House. If you've never heard this man or been aware of him, you've got something to become aware of. This man is the man that makes presidents out of paupers. I want to introduce you to Colonel House and how he made Woodrow Wilson President of the United States. This is a picture of Colonel Edward Mandell House and our president during the early 1900s, Woodrow Wilson. Colonel House made Woodrow Wilson President of the United States. Here's another picture showing Colonel Edward Mandell House with Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt became president because Colonel Edward Mandell House made him president. In other words, this man makes presidents out of paupers. I want you to know about this book as well. We're going to cover this book called Philip Drew Administrator. In this book, Colonel Edward Mandell House wrote in novel form about the takeover of the American government in the 1900s. He has his hero, Philip Drew, take over the presidency of the United States. He doesn't call the new president the president, he calls him the administrator. And Philip Drew, as president of the United States, written by Colonel Edward Mandell House, he gives America, quote, socialism as dreamt of by Karl Marx, unquote. Colonel Edward Mandell House was a Marxist communist. I didn't say he was, he said so himself in his own writings. And that's the man that made Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt President of the United States. We're going to start our study of American history back in 1776 with the American Revolution. We have been told by those who write the accidental view of history that the cause of the revolution was taxation without representation. That's what we were told by those who write the accidental view. I'm going to show you that wasn't the cause at all. The cause of the American Revolution was the need to create a central bank. We're going to see the fact this whole process of the need to create a central bank through the American Revolution all the way up to 1913. We're going to study the War of 1812. We were told once again that that was caused by England between America and England because of the conscripting, I believe, of American sailors off of English ships. We're going to see that wasn't the cause at all. The cause of the War of 1812 was once again the need to create a central bank. The Civil War of 1861 to 1865, we were told, was caused over the issue of slavery. Once again, I'm going to try to prove that the cause of the Civil War was not slavery, but the need to create a central bank. In fact, I'm going to point out one thing that should not be aware of. Not very many people in the last 24 years have come up to me and say they're aware of this little fact. I'm going to show you how Russia actually saved the United States. The Russian government, the Tsar of Russia, sent the Russian fleet to New York and San Francisco. This is a picture of one of those ships inside New York Harbor. When the Russian fleet came to America, it actually caused England and France to stay out of the war. And if Russia had not interceded in that war, the North probably would have lost. I want to introduce you to a group called the Knights of the Golden Circle. Now, this secret society has really been buried by those who write the accidental view of history, but once you understand their position and their role, then the Civil War will start to make some sense. One of the members of the Knights of the Golden Circle was John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. We're going to examine the election of 1912 and how that election was rigged so that we would create the central bank that the European bankers wanted as early as 1776. We got that central bank in the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. I'm going to explain to you that the Federal Reserve is not federal. It's privately owned. And I'm going to try to identify who those private owners are. I'm going to show you in this series that the crash of 1929 was planned as early as 1907. Some people benefited by foreknowledge about the crash. Those who planned it benefited, as we'll see. I'm going to identify some of the sources, some of the individuals involved in this conspiracy. Here's one I want to introduce you to. This is Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was an Englishman, and world government was his desire. This man wanted to rule the world, Cecil Rhodes. He created what we today call the Rhodes Scholarships. Those scholarships teach young people, especially bright young Americans and others, about his goal, one world government, and his desire to rule the world. I want to introduce you to a group called the Council on Foreign Relations. This is the group that picks our presidential candidates. We introduce you to a group called the Bilderbergers. Now that's not a hamburger over with onions. That's the name of a group that meets periodically, about every 6 months or so, and they make kings out of paupers. The Council on Foreign Relations makes presidents out of paupers. Here we're going to see the Bilderbergers make kings, foreign kings, out of paupers. Introduce you to a group called the Trilateral Commission. That is the group that makes presidents out of governors. Jimmy Carter, governor of Georgia, prior to his becoming president, was selected by the Trilateral Commission and made president of the United States. That group is still alive and well even today in the United States. We're going to examine the major media and why do we think as we do. We're going to talk about this thing called the population explosion. The population explosion was nothing but a dud. It was always a dud. It was never an explosion. Its purpose was to control people. It's a fraud and a hoax. There is no population explosion. We're going to talk about tax-free foundations. I want to talk briefly about Teddy Kennedy here. It's kind of interesting. Teddy Kennedy, on a talk show about 6 months or so ago, made the comment that he wanted to close the tax loopholes under which corporations pay no taxes. He was incensed by this, that huge corporations with billions of dollars worth of sales would not pay taxes. We're going to examine that, and we're going to see that Teddy Kennedy and his family owns a tax-free foundation that pays no taxes. Yet I didn't hear Kennedy rail against the tax-free foundations, only the corporations. We're going to examine that, and we're going to see why that is. I want to introduce you to this little paperback called The Report from Iron Mountain. If you've never read this book, you're missing a great deal of understanding about wars and times of peace. We're going to read this book, and we're going to see that this conspiracy considers wars as beneficial. Wars are good because they control people. That's their purpose. These people don't plan wars to fight an enemy. They use them to control people. Our taxes paid for that, by the way. Our government funded that study. We're going to study World War I and show you that Winston Churchill, later Prime Minister of England, Franklin Roosevelt, later President of the United States, and Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States at that time, actually sank the Lusitania, a huge passenger liner, to get America angry enough to enter the war. You might remember that Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election in 1916 before our involvement on the platform of the statement that he kept us out of the war. All the time he was campaigning that way, Woodrow Wilson and Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were planning our involvement in World War I. We're going to cover World War II. I'm going to show you that Adolf Hitler, the head of the German government, was a worshiper of Satan, Lucifer, the devil. Hitler joined a secret society called the Thule Society. And we're going to study that organization to show you why Hitler believed the way he did. He came from a very secret, occult organization that worshipped Lucifer. That group was financed by wealthy Americans. And in fact, as we're going to see later, all of Germany's, or at least a high percentage of Germany's war machine was built by Americans. Americans owned factories during World War II in Germany that were producing goods to kill Americans. And those plants were not bombed by American bombers. Isn't that interesting? There would have been no war in Germany, no World War II, without the support of these American capitalists. We're going to cover that in this series. We're going to discuss the fact that in 1943, Germany tried to surrender and that our government refused to listen. We're going to try to show you that in 1945, Japan tried to surrender and our government refused to listen. We're going to discuss the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we're going to answer the question, why did they want 2 bombs dropped? Why not just 1? And why did they pick the targets of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Why those 2 specifically? After the war was over, the American government and the American capitalists actually constructed the Iron Curtain. They didn't do it by actually building the wall step by step, but they did it by turning over the European countries to communism. We're going to cover that in that series on this class. We're also going to talk about America's war crime. We talked today about the Holocaust, the evil gassing of over 6 million Jews during World War II. I'm going to talk about America's war crime, where one man, a general, an American general, actually sent over 6 million Russians back to certain death in Russia after the war was over. It was America's war crime, an incredible story that we don't talk about even today. We're going to talk about how Russian communism has actually constructed communism and the Russian economy. This aid and trade has built the Russian economy, and in fact about 95% of that technology has come from the United States and NATO. Well, here's a good example of that. I'm going to show you that Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave Russia the atomic bomb in 1943 and 1944. You might remember that the Rosenbergs were executed because they allegedly did that. That was a terrible crime according to the judge, and yet here we see that it was Franklin Roosevelt that actually gave the atomic bomb to the Russian government. That aid and trade, as we're going to see, continues even today under President Ronald Reagan. Then we're going to change the subject, the direction of the course for a while. We're going to get into science. And we're going to see that science, evolution, and other myths, in fact that's the title of that series, that evolution could not have happened. We're going to use science to prove that, by the way, and we're going to show you that Karl Marx, the communist, and Charles Darwin, the evolutionist, were contemporaries, and they both believed that the philosophy of the other. We're going to hold up side by side the differences between creationism and evolution, and you're going to see, using science, as I say, that evolution is a fraud and a hoax, and it could not have happened. I'm going to introduce you to the new religion in America today called secular humanism. I'm going to read their own writings to prove that to you, that humanism is the official religion of the United States today. The word today, the common phrase today in our language, is the separation of God and state, or church and state. I'm going to show you that that is by design. They want to separate God and state and replace the belief in a religion with the belief in humanism, which teaches no belief in anything, as we're going to see. And that is today, as I believe, America's religion. I want to introduce you to John Dewey, who, by the way, was a humanist. He was the father of so-called progressive education. His moral philosophy is situation ethics, which teaches us to do our own thing. And it is going to be, as we're going to show you, America's new morality. We're going to explain Watergate and how Richard Nixon was removed intentionally by that activity, and that Nixon knew nothing at all about Watergate until after it was over. In other words, he was blackmailed and forced out of office. And I'm going to show you why that was. Why was it important to remove Richard Nixon from office? And lastly, I want to briefly cover the great victories that we've had in this battle, because there have been some great victories, and I would doubt that many of you even knew they were actual battles. And once you see that there have been some victories against this conspiracy, there is hope, and we'll cover that in the last session. Well, that's what we're going to cover in the next 24 weeks. My intent will be to induce you to stay tuned and tune in each week to listen to those lectures, and hopefully at the end of them you'll agree with me that there is indeed a conspiracy at work, and that we better do something about, first of all, understanding it, and then doing something about it. Let's start tonight's session with what I call God, Man, and Government. We don't have much time, but we'll go as far as we can. In fact, I want to mention that this class has not been rehearsed, so we might end in the middle of things quite often, but that's not by design, that's by accident. In other words, I don't plan it that way, it just happens. In other words, I prepared this thing, but it's intended for a classroom setting, and when I get to a certain point, I just end and pick it up the next week. So let's start then with our study tonight of God, Man, and Government. Our founding fathers believed that God, man, and government do have strings and connections, and that it's important for us to understand that. I believe that as they did, as we're going to see. Yet, as I said, today the call is to separate God and state, church and state, religion and state, and we're going to find out why that is. So let's go to the blackboard here, and we'll start our study of God, man, and government. And if we don't get through with it, or just the introductions of it, that'll be fine. We'll pick it up next week. I believe that there is a God, and if you're an atheist and say, I'm sorry, I don't agree with that, understand that you still will be able to fit in here, as I'm going to show you in a minute. But I believe that there is a God, and that God created man with rights. We'll discover what these rights are a little later in our series. But notice the connection. God created man with rights. Now, if you're an atheist, that's fine. I can understand that. I don't agree with you, but there's a place for you here as well. Even though you don't believe there's a God, you don't believe your rights come from God, your rights are inalienable, which means that no man can take them away. In fact, when you look up the word inalienable in your dictionary, you'll discover that's what it means. That no man, no government, no majority, no one has the right to take your rights away, which means they belong to you. That's this position as well. This position holds that if God gave us our rights, then only God can take them away. We're going to examine what those rights are, and we're going to see that men create government to protect those rights, and that when men violate other men's rights, they're punished. The atheist can also fit in as well. His rights are just like the God-fearers. They're inalienable. Man's rights, the man who believes in God, his rights are inalienable, as well as the atheist. It's an important understanding. Each man, each woman has these God-given rights, and they were given to that person when they were created. That means that if you're black or white, a male or a female, tall or short, young or old, American or Russian, a God-fearer or, as I said, an atheist, each of us has these rights equally, and that no one has the right to take those rights away. They are indeed inalienable. No majority, no minority, no nation, no bully, no aggressor, no one has the right to do that. And as I said, that's why we punish those who steal, murder, or falsely imprison another. We punish those who violate our rights. Let me show you an interesting quote here by Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson was a great champion of individual rights and human rights, and here's what he said, number 27. The God who gave us life gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God? Here's why. Number 28. William Penn said this: if men will not be governed by God, then they must be governed by tyrants. In other words, we have an option here. We have a choice. We can either allow our rights to be given to us by God, or they can be given to us by governments, by tyrants. Tyrants can take rights away. We have a choice. Let's go back to the blackboard here. Let's then hold up the other position, that government gives us our rights. Government grants us our rights. And here's the reason why there's a difference between this philosophy and this. This philosophy says if God gives us our rights, then only God can take them away. This position says government gives us our rights, and then conversely, if we believe that, government can take them away. They're no longer inalienable under this philosophy, are they? Because government can just pass a law and take away our rights. In other words, it says you don't have that right anymore. And we're going to see examples in our world today where this is the predominant philosophy of rights in that nation. We're going to see that during World War II, Hitler actually caused a law to be passed determining that the Jewish people in Germany had no right to life. I believe that right was given to them by God, and that no government had the right to take it away. Yet by law, because the government said your rights come from government, the government can pass a law taking those rights away. There are 4 references to God in the Declaration of Independence, America's founding document, and today we hear the call to separate God and state. We're going to see why that is. I believe it's because if there's no God, then government will be the source of our rights, and government can pass laws to take those rights away. Let me just show you very quickly one last thing. We're running out of time. This is a little government pamphlet printed not by the government but by the United Nations. It's called the International Covenants on Human Rights. We'll have just enough time probably to read this. number 29. It says the states recognize that in the enjoyment of those rights provided by the state may subject such rights only to such limitations as are determined by law. In other words, according to the United Nations and the United States, which signed that document, our rights are provided by law. We're going to see that's a dangerous, dangerous thought, and we're going to cover that in the next series. Thank you very much.
Conspiratorial view of history. It is the contention of historian Ralph Epperson that wars, revolutions, and depressions are planned years in advance, and that those who have been involved in the planning of these events have been ensuring that their involvement has been removed from recorded history. It will be Ralph Epperson's purpose to discuss the major events of the past and to remove the veil that has been utilized to cover up the secrets of history.
Welcome to Secrets of History. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I am the host of this series. Secrets of History is a 24-week lecture series which will explore the conspiratorial view of history. I've been studying the historical view that holds that the major events of the past have been caused intentionally. About 2 years ago, I published my book entitled The Unseen Hand. I've subtitled it An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History. It came out in 1985. Tonight's session is number 2 in the series, and tonight we're going to examine parts of the evidence that this conspiracy does indeed exist. Last week we examined the differences between the conspiratorial view of history and the accidental view of history. And we started our discussion of why man creates government. I explained that all men, have rights that have come from God. These rights belong to all men, and all men have them equally. I started a discussion of the 2 basic explanations about the source of these rights, God or government. I would like to give you an example of the position that our rights come from government. This is called the International Covenant on Human Rights. It's a little document that was published and proclaimed by the United Nations, the General Assembly, in 1948. I want to read part of that quote. The United States government approved this protocol, and this document was ratified by our government and officially represents their position on the source of our rights. Now, this is what our government agreed to. The covenant says, in part, number 29, the states, meaning those who've ratified this protocol, recognize that in the enjoyment of those rights provided by the state may subject such rights only to such limitations as are determined by law. Notice, our rights, according to the United Nations, are provided by the state. Our rights can be limited by law. Now, what does that mean? Our rights may be taken away from us by law. Government can say, you don't have that right anymore. The United Nations have said, we've passed a law taking it away. The government says, you have the right to religion except as provided by law. In Russia today, you must get permission to worship God because the official position in Russia is atheism. There is no God. Today in Russia, there are 6 million people in over 3,000 gulags, slave labor camps, over 1/2 of which, over 3 million people, are there in the gulags because they want to worship a God, their God, in a state that says there is no God. Their God-given right to worship has been taken away by law. Russia has passed a law. The Russian people have no right to worship. Now, there is another position completely contrary to the position of the United Nations. The other position is shown in the Declaration of Independence, this little document. Our founding fathers understood the difference and tried to protect all men's rights. When they wrote it, they wrote in part number 30. The founding fathers said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. I'd like you to notice that there are 4 extremely important truths in that sentence. Number one, these truths are self-evident. It's strange that today they're no longer self-evident. We're debating whether or not men have rights and whether they come from God or government. Our founding fathers said they were self-evident. Number two, that we're created equal but not equal. We are not equal, but we're created equal. We all start at the same place. We all have equal rights, but we're not equal. Number three, our rights are inalienable. Man cannot take them away. We'll discuss that in a few minutes. And number four, notice our founding fathers said our rights come from a creator. If you read the Constitution of the United States, you'll see this phrase, Congress shall pass no law. That means that Congress has no right to pass laws restricting man's rights. The statement is not a restriction of rights, it's a restriction on government. Now next I'd like to distinguish between a right and a privilege. I want to use the blackboard to do that, if I may. Let's start with our position that God grants man rights. The contrary position is that government grants man rights, but they're not called rights, they're called privileges. When God grants man his rights, only God can take them away. That's why our rights are inalienable. If you believe this sequence, then if government gives you a right, it can take it away by law, as we just read. That's the difference. It's extremely important. Only he who gives can take away. If God gives us our rights, only God can take them away. If government gives us our rights, then government can take them away. What is the latest slogan in the news today? Separate God from state. If you separate God from state, from our rights, then our rights do not belong to us, they belong to the state. Because if they come from government, then government can take them away. Another cry we've heard today in the newspapers, separate church and state. If you do, what becomes the source of our rights? Government. Then government can pass laws restricting our rights. Then they become not rights but privileges. God grants rights, governments grant privileges that can be taken away from us. Our rights no longer are ours if government gives them to us. The right to rights, and we'll discuss those human rights in a few minutes, includes the right to self-defense. Guns are not to protect us against our fellow man, although they do that, but were intended to give us the right to protect ourselves against government and those who come to take away our rights. The right to self-defense. Let's then define the two terms right and privilege. Number 31. A right is a freedom to act morally without asking permission. In the United States, we have the right to worship. It's God-given. Government cannot interfere. And that's exactly the case. As we're going to see a little later, we're going to read Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution. It says we have, or the Bill of Rights rather, it says we have the right to worship. A privilege is defined as number 32. Permission must be granted to act morally. Another example, man has a God-given right to travel. In Russia, you have no such right. It's been restricted by law. That's why in Russia today they build iron curtains. You cannot leave. You cannot travel. Some people, primarily the Jews, are permitted to leave, but the others can't. Because your right to travel is no longer a right, it is a privilege granted by government that can be taken away. And that's why they build walls around Russia. I'd like to mention that freedom is not an absolute. You can't be free to do whatever you choose. Rights carry responsibilities. You are not free unless you recognize the freedom of your neighbor, as we're going to see. Number 33, freedom is not the right to do what we want, but the power to do what we ought. You recognize my right, and I'll recognize your right, and then we'll both be free. Number 34, Liberty is the only thing you cannot have unless you are willing to give it to others. Now, this concept has been called the golden rule in religion. It says, quote, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." I believe that this is the basic philosophy of all of the major religions of the world. If you don't want someone to take your life, don't take the life of others. If you don't want someone to steal your property, don't steal the property of others. It is a completely moral, logical, and reasonable philosophy. It makes sense. Next, I'd like to compare the extremes of freedom. One is called liberty, and the other is called license. Let's define those two terms. I'd like to define liberty then as number 35, human rights with responsibilities. License is defined as no human rights because no one is responsible. License is called the law of the jungle, where the strong devour the weak. It is best described as might makes right. When people are free, when they have their liberty, all men have rights to life, liberty, and property. And we're going to discuss that again in a few minutes. Those are the three basic human rights: life, liberty, and property. When people do not respect the rights of others, only the strong have the rights to life, liberty, and property. What teaches respect for the human rights of others? Religion. Religion teaches restraints on people by saying such things as "thou shalt not." Today's religion is called situation ethics, and we'll discuss that later in about week number 20 in this series. And situation ethics teaches that that which is right in the situation, and whatever you decide at the moment is right, is right. In other words, there are no "thou shalt nots," because what each man thinks is right is right. I believe that the Ten Commandments are the greatest moral teaching that I know of. I believe that they simply teach that you are to recognize the basic rights of your neighbor. But notice that they were written on stone. I can remember that as a young boy, I wondered why they were written on the face of a stone tablet. I would like to give you my opinion as to why the Ten Commandments were written on stone and not on paper. I believe that God was telling man that man could not tamper with God's laws. They could not vote them away. They could not decide they were wrong. They were right. No majority, no minority, no army, no government can change God's laws. And that's why they were written on stone, I believe. Man cannot tamper with God's laws. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution contain such phrases as "Congress shall make no law," "the right of the people shall not be infringed," "no soldier shall be," "the right of the people shall not be violated," "no person shall be deprived," "the accused shall enjoy," and "the right shall be preserved." Notice these phrases in the Constitution recognize the principle that man's rights are not to be violated by government. They do not restrict men, they restrict government. They make man freer rather than restrict man. They restrict government. Now, what are those basic human rights? I believe, as I said, there are three. And once again, I'd like to write them down on the blackboard, and then we'll discuss each one of them in turn. These, I believe, are the three basic rights of man, all men, worldwide, anywhere you go. The right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. Let's write this in as well. These are man's three basic rights: the right to life, liberty, and property. Now, I can't avoid it, but it's a fact of nature that all men, no matter where they live on the face of the earth, are created hungry. I'm sorry, that's the way it is. Man needs property to survive, to keep himself alive. Man must have the right to keep that which he produces, or he'll starve. If one man can take the property of another, he will kill that man. All men have this right to property equally. All men, no matter where they live. We'll come back to that in a moment. George Mason, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, wrote this, number 36, that all men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights of which they cannot deprive their prosperity, among which are the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property. John Adams, second President of the United States, said this about property rights, number 37. Property is surely a right of mankind as real as liberty. The moment the idea is admitted into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God and that there is not a force of law and public justice to protect it, anarchy and tyranny commence. The right to private property. The religious teaching is, of course, thou shalt not steal. Nearly every society that I know of in the world today, and nearly, I'm sure all religions, believe that statement. No man has the right to take from another man. It's called stealing. However, there are people on this earth who disagree with that. One was Karl Marx, the so-called father of communism. And Marx wrote this, number 38. The theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. Notice what he said. We're going to abolish private property. Let's continue now. Not only must you have the right to keep that which you produce, but you must be free to acquire your private property. If I lock the doors on this studio tonight, that you people could not get out, I would not take your life, would I? I would take your liberty, your ability to go out and earn or acquire the property you need. I would kill you just as surely as if I shot you by taking away your liberty. You must be free to acquire the food you need to survive. Countries today build walls. Why? Because they want to take man's liberty. And when they do that, they own that man. China and Russia today build walls, restricting man's liberty to acquire that which he needs to survive. The nation that builds walls to keep its citizens in owns those people. Really, there's only one right. You need property. You need to be free to sustain your life. There's only one human life right, the right to life. It implies the right to liberty and implies the right to property. If I take away your property rights, I take away your life. If I restrict your liberty to acquire your property, I take away your life. Each man worldwide has the right to life, no matter who says to the contrary. Now, I've been accused of using simple examples to illustrate complex points, but I believe they work. We're going to now examine the right to private property, and we're going to see what happens when people start restricting man's liberty or restricting man's property rights. We're going to take 7 men and put them on an island, and we're going to see what happens. I want to start briefly with one simple man on an island. Now, of course, with one man on an island, there's no need to worry about property rights or rights to liberty or life, because there's no one else to take them away. He's free. However, when he's joined by others on the island, then we must develop concerns about his rights to life, liberty, and property. The right to private property implies the right to defend your private property. In other words, the right to self-defense. If one man steals from another, he murders the man he's stolen from. He takes his property, the man will starve. It's just as sure as shooting him. The human mind discovered, I'm sure way back when man was first created, that it was easier to steal than it was to work. So we must make punishment greater than the crime. I remember reading a short time ago about a politician who took a $100,000 bribe under the table for some contract or something, and he was fined $20,000. So the way I figured it out, he made an $80,000 profit on the deal, and I just asked myself whether or not that kind of punishment encouraged or discouraged crime. We must make crime, the punishment, more severe than the crime itself. If we don't, we encourage more criminality. Let's go back to the blackboard. I'm going to show you now how this little process works. And we're going to talk about property rights, right to acquire, right to self-defense, and then we're going to see how man can protect himself in a situation like this. Now, I've been told that's a Volkswagen, but it's not an early Volkswagen. That's a hill. And I'm going to put some people over here in prosperous valley where people really are able to use the very fertile soil and grow and prosper. We'll come back to this side over here in a minute. Let's start with the letter A, who moves into the valley, and as I said, by himself. There's no reason to concern himself with rights to life, liberty, and property. He's by himself. It's only when another man joins the island or joins that little valley that lives there that both A and B have to concern themselves with right to life, liberty, and property. Now let's just say that A has worked there a year before B comes on the scene, and B gets there and he's hungry. Can he steal, or does he have the right to take A's property? I contend that he does not. It's called stealing. Does A have the right, if B does take it, to protect his property? I think you would agree he does. It's called the right to self-defense. If B takes A's property, it's just like shooting him, isn't it? The man dies. Because if A is planted, let's say during the summer, and stored for the winter, and B comes and takes his food, A will starve. A has the right to self-defense. Every man, woman, and child in the world has the right to self-defense. It's only when A and B get together and say, listen, I'll protect your right to life, liberty, and property if you'll protect mine, and we'll share or work together, or I'll give you freely that which I've produced. So now, let's put C on the island. Let's say that B doesn't agree with that, and B says he goes to get A's property, and A says you can't have it, and he resists, and B gets a little angry about the scene and goes off and says to C, listen, here's what we'll do. The two of us together will come and take A's property late at night when he's not looking. Do B and C have that right, 2 against 1? No, of course not. Does A have the right to protect himself against B and C? Of course he does. If he's got the right to protect himself against B, he's got the right to protect himself against B and C. And B and C don't have the right. It doesn't matter how many people does it. In other words, the man together, A, B, and C have got to cooperate. If they don't, then we have a real problem. Now let's go over to the other side of the valley, or the mountain rather, and we'll put 4 more people into our little 7 men on the island scenario, our little example. Here we have D, E, F, and G, and they work in what I call NSP. That's not so prosperous. That's a valley where they're not able to produce as much as A, B, and C. In our little example here then, D, E, F, and G one morning, one of them crawls over the mountain and looks down over here and says, my goodness, look at this beautiful valley, and look at the food that those people have, and we're hungry. Do D, E, F, and G have the right to come over the mountain and break in and steal A, B, C's property? No. It's called stealing, isn't it? Do A, B, and C have the right, the God-given right, to protect themselves against D, E, F, and G? Of course they do. When D, E, F, and G attack A, B, and C, it's called war, isn't it? Generally, wars are fought, although we're not going to see later that's not quite true, but generally wars are fought because one nation thinks another nation has more land, more food, more resources, whatever. But A, B, and C have the right, inalienable right, to protect themselves against D, E, F, and G. I don't care whether there's 4,000 or 4 against 3, those 3 have the right, just as D, E, F, and G have to protect themselves against A, B, and C. It's called war when one man steals from another. Now let's just say that D, E, F, and G try this process, and they get over here, and there's a tussle and a fight, and they crawl back over the mountain, and they all lose. If they don't have the right to take it by war, is there any other method they can use to take A, B, and C's property? Let's just say that D crawls over the mountain and says to A, B, and C, why don't we sit down and talk about this? You've got more food than we do, and we're hungry. Let's get together and in a building on Thursday night, and we'll discuss your surplus, your goods that you have over and above what you're consuming. In fact, we'll put a flag on top to show you that this is a good idea and it's patriotic and everything else. So we get a meeting, all these 7 people join in the one room at the same time, and they decide, now, listen, you people have food, we don't have as much as we need. Why don't we sit down and discuss it? Okay, What's your point? D says, I know what we'll do. All those in favor of taking the property from A, B, and C and giving it to D, E, F, and G, raise your right hand. So D, E, F, and G vote yes. That's a good idea. We want to take the property. All those opposed, raise your right hand, and these three people vote no. So we now have a 4-3 vote. Do these four people have the right to vote their property away from them, A, B, and C, the minority? Of course not. Except when you call it a democracy, right? A democracy says, wait a minute, the majority rules. We're going to vote your property away. You're the minority. You do what you're told. The majority always rules. It's called democracy. Democracy votes people's rights away by majority vote, 4-3. They don't have that right, do they? It's called democracy. Our founding fathers tried to warn us over and over and over again not to do this, to stay away from this thing called democracy. Let's take a look at that. A couple of examples in a few minutes about what happens when the majority votes the rights away of the minority. When democracies vote your rights away, they steal from you. Your rights are not protected. They become privileges, don't they? Your right to private property becomes a privilege subject to the whim of the majority. The majority says we vote and we take. I want to show you what happens when majorities vote property rights away. To do that, I'd like to start by making two assumptions, number 39. Number one, I believe that individuals worldwide produce unequally. Some people produce more than others because they're stronger or they're smarter. Some can't produce at all because they're either old or they're children or they're infirm. So